Just thought I'd start by introducing the Malleefowl. They are a unique ground-dwelling species found in Australia that are about the size of a chicken. They're actually quite active, but they're really shy, so they're very, very hard to actually spot in the wild. And they're probably best known because they construct these massive, sort of 1 metre high mounds in which they incubate their eggs, and they're only one of 3 Australian species to do that. They occupy or have occupied a vast expanse of Australia, so pretty much the southern half of Australia. However, populations have been in decline in recent decades due to a variety of threats, and these include things like habitat clearing, altered fire regimes, overgrazing, and of course introduced predators such as foxes and cats. And this map here just shows how much the distribution has contracted in recent decades. So the grey shading here shows what we think is the historic range for Malleefowl, while the black shows what we think the current distribution is. So I really like this sort of Mallee area of Victoria. Because of this range contraction and population decline, the species is listed as vulnerable nationally and also threatened in all of the states and territories where it's found. And this has sort of sparked the public interest in Malleefowl as well. So there's this a national monitoring program has been going on, has been running for about 15 to 20 years, and this involves around 3,000 volunteers each year. So there's very much a sort of public affection for Malleefowl conservation. However, at the moment, the most common strategy to manage Malleefowl is to control for foxes, to bait for foxes. However, if you look back at the literature, there's actually conflicting evidence as to whether this is in fact effective. So there was some early experimental work that suggests that baiting is in fact good for Malleefowl. However, some more recent analyses of long-term data that's come out of the monitoring program suggests that managing foxes may not be quite as effective as we think. I'll just talk about one study as well. This also tried to quantify the uncertainty in the different types of management strategies that we could do for Malleefowl. So this is some work done by Michael Bode from the University of Melbourne. And what he did is he constructed this ecosystem model for Malleefowl. So it's how we think Malleefowl interacts with different components of the environment. You can see Malleefowls down here. Don't worry too much about the diagram, it's just to show that it's incredibly complex web of interactions. So we've got the different components of the ecosystem in boxes here, and then these arrows represent how those components interact with one another. What the authors did in this study is they then simulated each of these management actions to try and work out what happens to Malleefowl. So they looked at fox control, cat control, fire, and vegetation. And this box down here shows some of the results. On the y-axis we have change in Malleefowl population, so anything above that line they go up, anything below that line they go down. And the key message is there's a whole lot of uncertainty in what happens, particularly with fox baiting. We don't know if the model suggests that populations could go up or they could go down, and that's because of this very complex network. And this result, combined with the conflicting evidence in the literature, is sort of further motivation to try and resolve this uncertainty, to learn more about how effective baiting is for Malleefowl conservation. So if we think a little more about the relationship between baiting and Malleefowl, there's actually 2 uncertainties that we're interested in. The first one is whether baiting actually reduces fox densities. And then the second uncertainty we're interested in is whether this sort of carries through to Malleefowl. So does a reduction in fox populations then improve Malleefowl breeding activity? So the aim of this project is to design an adaptive management experiment so that we can learn more about these 2 uncertainties. Should we continue fox baiting, or should we switch to maybe something else for Malleefowl conservation? At this point I thought I'd talk a little bit more about what adaptive management is. when we manage ecological systems, they're often very complex, like that diagram I showed before, and there's often a whole lot of uncertainty that impact on what decisions we have to make. Adaptive management is a way to learn as you go. It's learning by doing. So what you do is you come up with a plan at the start. You work out what your objectives are, what you want to achieve, and also what you don't know, what you want to learn about. You then choose an action that best meets those objectives but also helps you to learn, so to resolve uncertainty. You implement that action, you do it, and then you evaluate and monitor what happens and you learn how successful that action was. Then you adjust what you do and you learn more. So it's this iterative cycle of learning while doing, and it's different to trial and error because you have a plan for learning, and over time you narrow down on what you think, on what is the best action for that species. So what we plan on doing in this project is designing an adaptive management experiment for malleefowl to learn about the effect of fox baiting on malleefowl persistence. And we are in the process of setting up a number of control and treatment sites all the way across the malleefowl's range. And so in control sites, we won't be baiting for foxes, but in treatment sites, baiting will occur in and around those sites. An important design feature of this experiment is that we want these control and treatment sites to be quite close to one another, and that's because there are a lot of natural, temporal and geographic sort of factors that affect malleefowl activity. So by having them close to each other, then we can try and tease out the effect that fox baiting has from some of these other factors that might influence breeding activities such as rainfall and fire. This map, as I said, we're in the process of setting up these sites, and this map just shows where these sites are going to be. So in total there's 41 distributed across southern Australia, so the whole range of malleefowl. Because of the large scale of this experiment and the number of sites, they fall on lots of different land tenures, so there's lots of different collaborators in this project. Because of the large scale, it's probably one of the largest adaptive management experiments ever attempted in Australia. There's a couple of sites here where we're already collecting data, and we anticipate to start collecting data from the majority of the sites by the start of next year. At each of these sites, we will be collecting a whole lot of data that we'll then analyse. We're particularly interested in the number of active mounds at each site, and we're going to be collecting data on this as a proxy for breeding success. So it's actually quite hard and expensive to track the individual movements of some of the young malleefowl. So by monitoring how many of the nests are actually active each year is a much easier way of monitoring, and it's something that volunteers can do. So most of this monitoring will be conducted by volunteers. We will also be putting out these motion-triggered cameras at each of these sites, and that's to get a better understanding of how baiting affects fox densities, so that first uncertainty that I mentioned earlier on. Because these sites fall across such a large area, we're collaborating with a number of agencies, including the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Bush Heritage Australia, mining companies, state governments, and also some Indigenous landholders as well. I just thought I'd talk really quickly about how we intend on analysing the data once it starts coming in. So as I said, we're collecting data on the number of active mounds at each of the sites, but we're also collecting data on some of the characteristics of each of the sites that we might also think might influence mound activity. So these are things like rainfall, fire, the type of habitat, and of course, whether or not baiting has occurred there. What we do once we collect data on this is we then sort of fit this regression model to the data, and we're interested in the strength of the effect, particularly that baiting has on the number of mounds that are active. And what we do is this data is collected each year. So what we do is we refit the data to each year as the data comes in, and that's formally how we learn about the strengths of these interactions. And we're particularly interested in narrowing down about the effect of baiting on mound activity. An important question is how long it might take to learn. So how long should we actually conduct this experiment for? And what we've done is a preliminary statistical analysis called a power analysis. And a power analysis is really a tool to help work out how long it might take to detect changes in what we're interested in this case, changes in the number of active mounds. We do a power analysis by taking some data that we already have, and then we simulate more data that we expect to collect in future, and then we use the models that I showed before to see whether we actually pick up on changes that occur in our simulated data. So power is really sort of our confidence of detecting any changes that might occur. So anything up here we have really high confidence, we have high power. Down here we don't have much power at all, so our experimental design isn't that useful. On this x-axis here we have the effect size, which is really just the change in Malleefowl mound activity. So down here, not much change happens. Right up here we're getting a large change in Malleefowl activity. These different lines on the graph here just show sort of the different number of years that the survey could run for. So the blue line shows our power if we run the survey just for 1 year, so run the experiment for 1 year. The black line shows our power if we run it for 5 years. So the longer we run the experiment, the more power we have to detect any changes that might occur. The key point from this slide is that given the data that we already have and given the 41 sites that we intend on setting up this experiment, if we get a small change in mound activity, then it should take us around 5 years of running the experiment to confidently pick up on that change. However, if we get sort of a moderate change in mound activity, then it should take around 2 to 3 years of running the experiment to confidently say that that change has happened. So this is just a tool to help us work out how long it might take us to learn to conclusively say something about the effect of baiting on Malleefowl and whether we should switch to something else. So in summary, this is one of the biggest adaptive management experiments that's ever been attempted in Australia, and this is because of the sheer scale that we're trying to set up all these plots and the number of agencies that are involved. We're trying to learn about primarily the relationship between fox baiting and Malleefowl persistence. Is it something we should continue with, or should we switch to something else? However, there's also going to be broader implications as well. So we'll also learn about the effect of baiting on fox activity and also other predators that are in this system. And because we're doing this across a large area, we might be able to understand how these uncertainties vary across space, so in different parts of Australia as well. We're already collecting data from a couple of sites that we anticipate that the experiment will be up and running by the start of next year. So thanks everyone.